Hello, my name is Chloe McDonald. I'm an attorney at Harder, Seacrest and Emery, and I'm here today to conduct a training on confidentiality in a school setting. Why are we here? Because we all know that student confidentiality is very important, and it is important for us as individuals, and it is important for the school as a whole. If we fail to protect student confidentiality, that can result in individual consequences such as discipline or termination as employees or a loss of certification. And failure to protect student confidentiality can also result in penalties to the school. The goal of today's training is to understand confidentiality requirements and best practices in this area. Bottom line, the more we know about this topic, the better we can prevent failures in the future. There are several laws that address student confidentiality that are listed on the slide. It includes New York State Education Law 2D, the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, the IDEA, and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. Now, the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, FERPA, is the one you've probably heard of. People throw around FERPA like they throw around HIPAA in the medical context. But Lavelle is in a very unique position in that it does not directly receive federal funds, which is a requirement for FERPA's application. Does that mean we get to just forget about student privacy? Absolutely not. And New York State would not allow us to do so because there is a very important New York State law, New York State Education Law 2D, that protects student privacy. And that's what our training today will focus on. So what is Education Law 2D? It is a New York law that applies to schools, including Lavelle, that requires the protection of student data, and it covers student data in any form. That could be electronic or paper records. It even could be a video or an audio tape or film. The New York State Chief Privacy Officer issues determinations in this area and recently issued a determination holding that a school should have done more to blur out other students' faces from a video taken of an incident that resulted in some discipline for the students. And that was found to be part of the student's record. And there were supposed to be some steps taken to blur the video of the other students' faces when it was shared with some additional parties. So yes, even a video could be student data. EdLaw 2D has two components. It has a privacy component. Privacy is the right to control how your information is viewed and used. And it also has a security component, which is protecting information against threats. Education Law 2D provides parents with rights regarding their child's personally identifiable information. The rights of parents or eligible students, so students over the age of 18, are to be able to inspect and review their students' education records, to request amendment of inaccurate or misleading records, and to prevent the disclosure of this information without their consent. And we'll talk a little bit more about consent later in this training. So what is student data? Well, people who write laws love to write circularly. So student data means personally identifiable information from student records of an educational agency like a school. So what is student personally identifiable information? Well, that includes a number of things. It includes direct identifiers, such as a student's name or their student ID number. It could include their parents' name or address. It could include indirect identifiers, such as the student's date or place of birth, their mother's maiden name. It includes information that alone or in combination with other information is linkable to a specific student and would allow a reasonable person in the school community without personal knowledge of the relevant circumstances to identify the student with reasonable certainty. And what do I mean by that? That means when we take some information and maybe it's like a trail of breadcrumbs, right? There's a little bit of information here, a little bit there. And when you combine it all and you look at the context, you can say, oh yeah, well, you're talking about that student, right? Because we know what grade they're in and we know where they sit and we know who their friends are. We know whose parents are implicated, right? It's that trail of breadcrumbs that leads you to figure out who the student is with reasonable certainty. It also includes information requested by a person who the school reasonably believes knows the identity of the student to whom the education records relate. So maybe a parent reaches out to you and say, hey, I know that my son or daughter got into a fight today at school. I'd like to see video from that fight. They likely know who their child got in a fight with, and so producing that video would be sharing information about a student who is probably known to the parent who's making that request. Since we've talked about what student data is, and we know it's a very expansive definition, we also need to talk about what it is not. So there's a couple categories of information that are not student data. They are not student PII. This includes de-identified data, so data regarding a student that uses random identifiers. So not the last four of their social, not their student ID number, truly random numbers or identifiers. Aggregate data, such as data that's reported at the school district level. You know, all of our 8th graders scored an average of 91 on this, state test, right? That aggregate data is not student PII. And also anonymous data that could not be used to identify a particular student. So when we truly have no trail of breadcrumbs that would lead back to that particular student. So here are some guidelines, some general tips and best practices for protecting student data. The first is that student data and email don't mix. We talked about the expansive definition of student data. We know that it covers a lot of things, and we use email a lot. However, we should only send student data via email if it's necessary, and we should take steps to make sure those emails are protected with encryption if we are going to do it. We also don't need to let that student data sit in our inbox. That's not the best place to store student data. If we have student data to store, it should be moved to the appropriate place, whether that be a hard copy file or to store it in PowerSchool. But leaving it in our inbox is a vulnerable place for that information. So we should move it to where it should be stored, and then we can delete it out of our inbox. Again, not deleting the record, just making sure it's stored in the appropriate place and then removing it from our inbox. The only place where we should be putting student data and storing student data is in a secure school-approved platform. We should not be using any unapproved software. Everything that we're using should be formally approved by the school. Unapproved software is not being tracked, it's not being patched, and that can lead to vulnerabilities in the software. It can open the school up to hacking, and that student data may be released as part of that. And when it comes to social media, we should follow the school's policy and only use social media for school purposes. When we're using social media, maybe a student had a really great opportunity and we want to share something about that on our social media pages because it's just cool, right? They won an award, they got a scholarship, they succeeded in a sporting event. We should make sure that we have parental consent for posting that information or posting a photo of a child onto the school's social media. And again, we'll talk about what that consent means in a few slides. Education Law 2D has a focus on third-party compliance and making sure that schools are engaging with vendors that receive student data and protecting that data that is shared with vendors. Education Law 2D provides very specific protections and requirements for when schools contract with third-party contractors. So who is a third-party contractor that works with a school? It could be really anyone. Usually it's electronic, but it could be otherwise. It's any entity that receives student data or teacher or principal data from a school pursuant to a contract or other written agreement for the purposes of providing services to that school. So think of how many service providers we have that may receive student data. Now, you might think, geez, I would never inadvertently enter into a third-party contract or relationship, right? I would never just enter into a written agreement and not realize I had done it. But think about how easy it is to accept terms of service online. You just see the click box, if you want to sign up for an account here, click here to accept our terms of service. That acceptance creates a written agreement. So it's a lot easier than you think to get tangled up with a third party and sharing data with them. Bottom line, you should follow the approval process for any dealings with third-party vendors, especially when we're talking about electronic vendors or software. The school policy states that staff will not download or install software or programs onto Lavelle computers or the Lavelle network, and that all software or program installation requests require prior approval and then will be installed by the Lavelle network administrator. Bottom line, if it hasn't been approved by school leadership, you should not be using it. Switching back to rights of parents and others to inspect student data or student records. Lavelle has an obligation to abide by validated, legitimate requests for student records. Records can be accessed by school personnel with a legitimate educational interest. What does that mean? It means that the school person who's accessing the records has a real reason to be doing so. If I teach 8th grade, I probably don't need access to a first grader's records, right? And so we wall things off to not just be open to any school personnel, but only to be open to school personnel who have a legitimate educational interest in that student's records. As I mentioned before, parents, guardians, eligible students have a right to access and view their child's educational records. A parent includes, a natural parent, a guardian, or any individual acting in the place of a parent or guardian, if that's set out by an official court or government order. In the case of divorce or separation of a student's parents, both parents have a full right to the records unless we see some legally binding document or law that revokes these rights. So I know there can sometimes be drama when there's a divorce or separation and one parent won't want the other one to have access. But until we see something from a court saying that that parent cannot have access, both parents have equal access to a student's records. Officials from government agencies also have access to records. That would likely be NICED in our case, and there would be an official request for that. Once a request has been made, it must be responded to within a reasonable time period, which is generally considered to be about 45 days. So LSB has a process for the disclosure of information. If you receive a request for information directly, you should float that request up to school leadership. At that point, the school leadership can take reasonable steps to authenticate the identity of the records requester. We want to make sure it's not a fake request. We want to make sure it's not some scammer trying to get personal information out of us. So if it's a parent reaching out for their student's records, we want to make sure that it's actually the parent who's making the request. And then the request and the disclosure of records are logged, and the log document includes specific information to keep track of where records have been disclosed. I mentioned before that we should avoid keeping student data in emails. I bring this up again here to think about some implications of the student records that we're creating. If we're keeping student data in emails and somebody requests all of their students' records, then do we want to have to produce those emails later on in response to that records request? Do we want to have to explain that email to a parent? So I encourage you to document things about students, knowing that a parent may be reading this someday, and we want to make sure we feel really confident in how it's documented. And it may be, maybe we're frustrated, maybe we have some frustrations, but when we put those in the student records, we put those in emails about the student and with student data, then those may be produced later on, which I think should help, should be the lens that we view when we're writing emails or documenting stuff about our students. Consent is an important concept under Ed Law 2D, and as a general rule, Lavelle must have a parent's or an eligible student's written consent before it can disclose personally identifiable information from the student's educational records to a third party. What does consent mean? Well, it has to be written, it has to be signed and dated, and it has to include the following information: the specific records that are going to be disclosed, the purpose of the disclosure, and the identity of the individuals or groups who would have access to the records, right? So we're going to post something about a student who received an award on our webpage, and we get consent from the parent that we're going to post about the student winning this XYZ award for the purpose of sharing this good news with the school community. And this will be posted on the school website that is, generally accessible to the public, right? And then the parent would sign and date that consent, which includes all of the specific information. Under Education Law 2D, if there's been a breach, right, if student data has been shared inappropriately or not to somebody who has a right to the information, or has been shared without consent of a parent, then the school may have an obligation to report a breach of student information. We need to make sure that if we think that something has gone on, we've sent an email to the wrong person in our inbox, we've left a bag of student, including student data, on the subway or in an Uber, right? We need to make sure we escalate those issues internally so that the school can assess whether it is or is not a breach of student PII, and that will depend on the information that was involved and the protections that are put in place. When I was putting this training together, I was talking to some of my colleagues about confidentiality, and we were talking about our laptops. I work off of a laptop. I have a lot of information stored on there. And one of the partners mentioned, if you lost your laptop, we've got so many levels of encryptions and a BitLocker and all of those things that we can just remotely wipe that laptop and there wouldn't be possible for there to be a breach of information. So it's important to escalate those things internally to assess whether or not there is a breach and what the school can do as far as damage control. If there has been a breach, there is an obligation to notify parents of affected students and also NICED. Generally, you have to inform parents as soon as possible, and you have like 10 days to inform NICED. So it is a very, very quick turnaround for informing parents and providing this notification, which is why we shouldn't sit on this information and hope for the best. We need to escalate it internally right away. We can't just ignore it. We have to inform school leadership. You may be thinking to yourself, we're talking about student data and breaches of student data. Who the heck would want to take student data from a school? Like, that's not exciting. It's not credit card numbers, right? What would a hacker do with that information? Well, it turns out, this is something I learned while putting this training together, that schools are a really big target for hackers right now, because the hackers know that schools have a lot of information that is legally required to be protected, and they carry insurance to protect that information, and they're hoping for a payday if they can get into your system and they can lock you out of your records, and then they can ransom the money from you to reopen those records or delete those records. It can be lucrative to these bad actors, and so there are quite a few data breaches that have occurred. Some of them malicious, some of them just accidental, and they've made headlines. In New York City, there was a recent, rather large data breach. The city school district was using MoveIt as a vendor for file sharing. It was a file sharing software. And because of a vulnerability in MoveIt, right, something the school really had no control over, but because of that, over 45,000 students and staff's data was shared, and there was just a 0-day vulnerability in the MoveIt software that was exploited. So that's something that, we all need to be aware of. Sometimes it is our fault, sometimes it's not. Sometimes, our contractors or vendors have done something and the law requires them to inform us so that then we can inform our constituents. I want to touch base on the hackers hit school district in Clark County, Nevada. So in this case, the hackers have access to the data and they're seeking a monetary payout in exchange for deleting stolen data. That is exactly the concern that we have about that. So we just want to prevent that from happening. It's unfortunately more common, and it is becoming more common as time goes on. So what are some ways that a hack or a data breach can occur? Well, the first one is through email compromises. These are some things that we see schools struggle with. It's another good reason to keep student data outside of an email. So that way, if an email box gets compromised, there hasn't been a breach of student information. The bad actor tends to send some sort of a phishing link, looking for your password. They may impersonate you. They could be trying to use your inbox to send spam to other people in your network and try to phish them too. So we should not click on links that we don't recognize. We should not put our passwords into websites that we don't recognize. And if we think we've received a suspicious email, we should let the school know, because even if we caught it, we're like, oh, geez, this definitely came from somebody impersonating somebody else. Your colleagues may not have caught it, and this will allow the school to get ahead of that and send out an email like, hey, there's been a phishing email sent to one of our staff members. If you've also received this email, please delete it. When there's been an email compromise, sometimes you might not know about it for weeks or months. The bad actors are very good at hiding their fraudulent activity. They set up rules to hide what they're doing in your inbox. And so it's a real consideration and a good reason to keep student data and other confidential information out of our mailboxes. So ransomware is when there's been extortion by a third-party bad actor. It was those headlines that I was just talking about on the other page. Hackers can get in and they can encrypt and steal data, and they look to leverage to get that payout, to get the data released or deleted by the school. And so we definitely want to make sure that we avoid falling victim to phishing emails to allow those bad actors initial access to our system. Another way that there can be a data breach is when we just make a mistake, and it's human and it happens, right? We are drafting up an email and, we meant to send it to Amy, and we have like 4 different Amy's in our contacts, and we send it to the wrong person, right? We send it to the wrong Amy. Oops. We've lost our laptop. We've left it somewhere. We've lost hard files. Maybe we have a data room or a Dropbox where we're keeping information, and we accidentally grant access to the wrong person to that information. This also can address hard copy files, and that's what this clean desk violation bullet point talks about. We should not leave student data out on our desk. We should keep it locked up and secure, that so somebody else who's walking through our workplace can not stumble across those hard copy records. Okay, we've made it to our scenarios, just a couple to help us play out how we might respond. Scenario 1, Jamie is a student at Lavelle. Jamie's mother sends an email to Jamie's teacher, Miss Sue, asking for a copy of Jamie's attendance records, report cards, IEP, etc. What should Sue do? Step 1, Sue should vet the email herself. Does it seem fishy, or does it seem okay? Is the email coming from an email address that we would expect to belong to Jamie's mother, or is it some random word and number thing that just looks sketchy? Assuming the email looks okay, she should share that request with school leadership so that school leadership can coordinate a response to this records request. The school can then take additional steps as necessary to verify the request and the identity of the requester. Assuming all of that is legit, the school will then provide records within the reasonable period of time. Now, what if Jamie's parents were divorced and Jamie's mother was the one reaching out and not Jamie's father, and you knew they were divorced? Would that make any difference? No, it wouldn't, unless there's some sort of court order prohibiting a parent from seeing the records. Both are entitled to look at that information. Scenario 2. Mr. Rob hears about a neat classroom management tool online called Class Dojo from a friend who works at a different school. The Class Dojo website advertises that teachers can sign up for free. And the website seems pretty cool. I mean, when we look at this clip out from the website, it says you can connect with families, send messages, schedule events, keep students engaged. You can share everyday magic, offer a window into students' worlds with a private story feed for photos, videos, and more. Can also help students shine, points, big ideas, and more, help kids set goals and become their best selves. Based on the information in the little screenshot here of what the website offers, I think we can all agree that student data would be entered and shared on this website, right? You'd be sending messages with their parents. That's going to be part of the education record, sharing photos or videos of students that identify them. That would be part of, that would be covered student data. It also looks like you might be able to include grades or something to that effect on this website. So what should Mr. Rob do if he thinks this is a cool tool? Well, he should bring the idea up to school leadership. He should not just sign up for it and click the accept terms and conditions box and start using it on his own. That should go through the third-party contractor approval process with the school. Also, if he brings this idea up to school leadership, I've had situations where clients have had, teachers reach out trying to use a different app for some function, and it turns out the school already has that resource. Recently, some teachers wanted to use WhatsApp to translate because they had some students with parents who spoke different languages, and they wanted to have a way to communicate with them. In that case, the school was able just to inform the teachers and share with them that they already had a platform with the same type of service that allowed for translation. And so who knows, if you raise a good idea to the school, they may go ahead and look into that software, or they may have some sort of software vendor that can provide the same type of service for you. It's definitely worth the ask, but we should just not, charge ahead and sign up for it and start using it with student data without looking into it further. Scenario 3, Mr. Tim rewards select students for exhibiting growth in their reading scores by calling those students to the front of the room and giving them an ice cream party. A parent from Mr. Tim's class complains that this constitutes an implicit disclosure of PII grades because students were able to discern who had improved their reading and who had not by observing which students were called to receive ice cream at the front of the class. Has there been a violation of student privacy? You might think, geez, this is a weird scenario, but this is actually based off of a determination made by New York State's chief privacy officer. A parent truly did complain about this and brought that complaint to the chief privacy officer. So what do you think? Was the school in the right or the wrong here? So in this case, the school was actually in the right, and there was not a violation of student privacy because students' actual grades and reading levels were not shared. It was just a general reward for doing better or improving. And because there wasn't that specific information, there was not a breach of student privacy. In our last scenario, scenario 4, Miss Cheryl brings home student papers to grade on occasion. Miss Cheryl leaves her work bag with the papers in her car overnight and the bag is stolen. Oh no. What should Miss Cheryl do? Miss Cheryl should report the theft to school leadership. Depending on the contents of the papers that were stolen or that were in her bag, they might include student PII, and thus this may constitute a data breach that the school would then need to address and report up. The theft of paper records should be treated the same as the theft of electronic records. This brings us to the end of our training. If you have any questions about this area, I encourage you to reach out to school leadership to have those questions addressed. And I'm sure that they'd be happy to talk through any of the training materials with you. Thank you.